We're going to leave epithelial tissue now, and we're going to talk about the second kind of tissue on our list, which is connective tissue. Connective tissue, just like all tissue, is made out of different types of cells that come together to function as a group. And just like we saw with epithelial tissue, in addition to the cells, there's also extracellular matrix that surrounds the cells and helps sort of glue them together. Remember, extracellular matrix is made out of protein fibers, something called ground substance, and water. Now we're going to talk about connective tissue in the same way we talked about epithelial tissue. We'll start off by talking about its function, and we'll talk about its structure and so on. We'll talk about all the ways that we classify connective tissue as well. Now, the function of the connective tissue is to support, to protect, and to bind together the physical structure of the organs in the body. Recall what an organ is. Since a tissue is different types of cells that come together to work as a group, an organ is different types of tissues that come together and work as a group. And connective tissue is literally binding all of those different types of tissues together. Connective tissue is supporting and protecting structures in the body. There are a lot of structures in the human body that are made out of connective tissue. For example, tendons and ligaments are made out of connective tissue. And the only difference between those two is that a tendon is going to connect muscle to bone, and a ligament is going to connect bone to bone. Both of those are made out of connective tissue. Cartilage is connective tissue. Bone is a type of connective tissue. Fat tissue or adipose is connective tissue, and so is blood. People are often very surprised when you tell them that bone and blood are actually types of connective tissue. But as we talk about the characteristics of connective tissue, you'll see that these things fit right in. So, there are lots of structures in the body made out of connective tissue, and there are a lot of different types of cells inside connective tissue. For example, there are fibroblasts in connective tissue. There are chondrocytes. There are osteocytes. There are adipocytes. There are erythrocytes and leukocytes. Now, with the exception of a fibroblast, all of these cell types have this cyte portion to them. When you translate that cyte portion, that just means cell. Leukocyte means white cell. Erythrocyte means red cell. You can see that while these terms can be quite a mouthful to say, when you actually think about what the term means, what it translates as, it can sometimes be helpful to know what kind of cell it is. So fibroblasts are found in ligaments and tendons. Chondro, which just means cartilage, is found in cartilage. Osteo means bone. Adipo means fat. And we talked about the blood cells a moment ago. So lots of different types of cells found in connective tissue. Now, I just want to say a brief word about how connective tissue comes about in an embryo and a fetus. Remember, all connective tissue contains cells and extracellular matrix. In fact, All tissue is made up of cells and extracellular matrix. But when it comes to connective tissue, if you look way, way, way back in the earliest moments of your development as an embryo, there was a point a couple of weeks into your mother's pregnancy when the embryo that became you first started to develop different layers within it. Those first 3 layers created an embryonic structure that we call a gastrula. Now, that term is not important for you to know. What's important for you to know is that a gastrula has 3 layers in it. It has what's called ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. Now, take a look at the drawings down at the bottom. On this drawing on the left-hand side, we can see the very earliest stages of development of a human embryo. It starts off with an egg that gets fertilized by sperm to become a single-celled embryo called a zygote. Now that single-celled embryo is going to start dividing, right? One cell is going to become 2 cells, and then 2 cells are going to become 4 cells. And all of this is happening in the first couple of days of pregnancy. This is also all happening inside the oviduct inside the woman's body. Now, we used to call the oviduct the fallopian tube, but that term has kind of fallen out of favor. The oviduct is the tube that connects the ovary to the uterus. And the earliest stages of development are going to happen in that tube. Now, eventually, the embryo is going to arrive at the uterus. And by that time, there are hundreds and hundreds of cells in there. We call this stage the morula stage. And then the next stage involves the development of a cavity inside the embryo. They're showing that as this dark area. There's just a fluid-filled cavity in here. The blastocyst stage, which is where we're at right here, happens around day 7 or 8 in a human. And this is the stage just before the embryo will implant into the wall of the uterus. Now in this drawing over here, we're looking at what happens right after implantation. And that's this development of a gastrula. This blastocyst embryo, after it implants into the uterus, is going to begin developing into 3 separate layers. The ectoderm, which is found on the very outside of the embryo, the mesoderm, which is found in the middle, and then the endoderm, which is found on the inside. Those 3 layers are going to give rise to all of the types of tissues, all of the types of cells in the human body. Those 3 layers are going to give rise to everything that eventually becomes the human infant. What's interesting to know is that that middle layer, the mesoderm, is what's going to give rise to all of the different types of connective tissue. So part of the reason that there are so many different cells in connective tissue is because there is a big, broad variety of connective tissue. And all of that connective tissue came from the same layer inside that human embryo, maybe 10 or 12 days into development. Now, because connective tissue is so diverse, because there are so many different types of it, we classify it. Of course we do, because it's anatomy and physiology, and we love classification. There are 3 broad categories of connective tissue. There's what we call connective tissue proper. There is supporting connective tissue. And please note, it's not supportive connective tissue, it's supporting connective tissue. And finally, there's what's called fluid connective tissue. Now, under each of these headings, I have listed two different types. So, connective tissue proper has both a loose type and a dense type. Supporting connective tissue includes both cartilage and bone. And fluid connective tissue includes both blood and lymph. And lymph is simply the fluid that flows through your lymphatic vessels in your body. We're going to return to this slide in a little bit, but for now, I want you to know that we're going to focus primarily right here. We're going to focus on connective tissue proper because there are the most types of connective tissue in this category. Connective tissue proper contains the greatest number of cell types among all of the three types of connective tissue. Connective tissue proper has the most variety in it. When you look at all of the different types of cells in connective tissue proper, you can put them into two groups, what are called resident cells and what are called wandering cells. Now, all a resident cell is a cell that is part of connective tissue proper that stays put. And you're probably thinking, well, don't all cells stay put? The truth is, no. Some cells are capable of changing their position. Some cells are capable of moving around through tissue. Resident cells are the stationary kind. And it's the job of resident cells to support, maintain, and repair the extracellular matrix. So those cells are actually doing the work of keeping the extracellular matrix healthy. Now, what kind of cells are resident cells? We've mentioned a couple of these a moment ago. Fibroblasts are resident cells. Adipocytes are resident cells. There are a couple of others found in connective tissue proper. There are what are called mesenchymal cells. This is a terrible word to spell, but it's pronounced mesenchymal. Those are the stem cells of connective tissue. Remember, a stem cell is a cell that can divide and produce more of the same type. Lastly, there's a type of resident cell called a fixed macrophage. This is a type of immune cell. Now, if you translate this word macrophage, it means big eater. So these are immune cells whose job it is to surround and consume foreign pathogens and materials that don't belong in the body. So fibroblasts, those are the types of connective tissue cells that we find in tendons and ligaments. Adipocytes, those are fat cells. Mesenchymal cells and fixed macrophages, those are the types of resident cells that are found in connective tissue proper. The other type of cell is called a wandering cell because this is the kind of cell that moves around. In fact, it moves around through the tissue constantly. It's constantly moving its position. Now, all wandering cells are part of the immune system. Now, this may be a surprise to you. You may have believed that immune cells are only found in the bloodstream. But wandering cells are actually a type of immune cell that's found in tissue. And there are immune cells found in other types of tissue as well. So wandering cells are on the move. I have a list here of the kinds of wandering cells that we find in connective tissue proper. There are mast cells, plasma cells, free macrophages, neutrophils, and T lymphocytes. All of these are considered white blood cells or leukocytes. Mast cells are the kind of immune cell that can release histamine during immune reactions. And histamine, of course, is what contributes to inflammation. Plasma cells are the cells that are capable of producing antibodies. Macrophages, as we've said, are the big eaters. Neutrophils are a type of white blood cell that are important in the first line of defense in immunity. And so are T lymphocytes, another type of white blood cell. So there are resident cells and there are wandering cells present in connective tissue proper. Remember, all three types of connective tissue, including connective tissue proper, have extracellular matrix as well. And we said extracellular matrix contains protein fibers, ground substance, and water. Now we're going to talk a little bit about extracellular matrix. What are the protein fibers that you find in ECM? These include collagen fibers, what are called reticular fibers, and elastic fibers. These three types of protein fibers are going to give extracellular matrix a little bit of stability. Remember, this is the material, this extracellular matrix, that's holding all of the cells together in a tissue. And it has to have some resilience to it. It has to have some strength to it. Ground substance is an important component of extracellular matrix. It doesn't have any cells in it. Remember, this is what surrounds the cells and holds the cells together. Ground substance is kind of a fascinating material. It actually is composed of protein and carbohydrate. And depending on which type of connective tissue you're looking at, some ground substance is quite viscous and thick, and some of it is almost semi-solid, and some of it is solid. So it depends. It depends on whether or not you're looking at blood, which is a type of connective tissue proper that has a viscous ground substance in it, thick ground substance. Cartilage, which has a semi-solid ground substance in it, or bone, which has a solid ground substance in it. So ground substance is kind of fascinating, I think. So protein fibers, ground substance, and water are what make up extracellular matrix. Let's take a minute now and go through these protein fiber types in extracellular matrix to see how they differ. Remember, there's collagen fibers, there are reticular fibers, and there are elastic fibers in ECM. Collagen fibers are a very abundant type of protein fiber. In fact, if you took the human body and you broke it down into piles of material, a pile of all the protein, a pile of all the carbohydrate, all the lipid, all the nucleic acid. If you went to the protein pile, 25% of that pile would be collagen fiber. Isn't that amazing? Collagen is found abundantly throughout the body. And that's because, it's part of extracellular matrix. And extracellular matrix is found in all types of tissue. Now, collagen fibers have a pretty distinct look to them. They are unbranched. They are straight line, unbranched fibers. And they look under the microscope like cables. They also appear as a white color if the tissue that you're looking at is fresh. So in other words, in surgery, or if you're looking at a tissue in a laceration. Collagen fibers actually have a real look to them. They are very white colored in fresh tissue. Now you would have to look under the microscope to see them. But yes, there are times in surgery when we examine tissue under a microscope. Now, reticular fibers have a very different look to them. Reticular fibers are branched. They are almost like a mesh or a net of fiber. They are very thin, much thinner than collagen fibers, and you find them particularly in what's referred to as the stroma of the organs in the body. Now, what is stroma? Stroma is one of those sort of generic terms. It refers to sort of the structural parts of an organ as opposed to the important functional parts of an organ. So reticular fibers, because of their mesh-like quality, offer really nice support for other types of tissue in an organ. Finally, there are elastic fibers. The elastic fibers, like the name suggests, are very elastic. They're stretchable. They can expand and relax quite easily. Like reticular fibers, they tend to be branched, but unlike reticular fibers, they are very wavy. When you look at them under the microscope, they're not linear. They're wavy. When you look at an elastic fiber in fresh tissue under the microscope, it's not going to appear white like collagen does. It's going to have a very distinct yellow appearance to it. Now, when we take some tissue in the laboratory and we put it onto a microscope slide, so it's no longer fresh, when we stain that tissue, we often stain elastic fibers so that they appear black. So you can always find elastic fibers because they take on a very distinct black color when we stain tissue. On this slide, you're looking at a sample of connective tissue proper as it appears under the microscope. Now I want you to notice that there are very distinct color differences in different regions of this tissue. First of all, you can see these almost greenish structures that look sort of oval. Then you can see these sort of long brownish structures. And then you can see this pink material. Now there's also white visible, but the white is really just the space that has occurred between all the rest of this as we placed it onto a microscope slide. So what you're looking at here is connective tissue proper. And it has these components that we've mentioned. First of all, like all tissues, it has cells and it has extracellular matrix. The cells are the green oval structures. The extracellular matrix is protein fibers, ground substance, and water. You're not going to see the ground substance, you're not going to see the water, but you can sure see the protein fibers. You can see them as these long straight lines in here, and you can also see them as this pink material in the back. It turns out that the pink material happens to be collagen fibers, and the dark brown black material happens to be elastic fibers. Can you see how they're sort of wavy in places. Those are elastic fibers. The cells in this particular sample happen to be fibroblasts, which is one of the types of resident cells that we find in connective tissue proper.